He rode into Mercy Ridge asking for the one answer he feared more than a bullet. By sundown, he was lying at the bottom of an old windmill cistern, bleeding into the dust. The plank beneath Jonah Vale's boot split with a crack so sharp it scattered the horses from the fence line. For half a second, he saw nothing but white New Mexico sky. Then the earth swallowed him. His shoulder struck the wall first. His ribs hit stone. Dust burst up around him, thick enough to choke. Above him, the opening of the cistern shrank into a bright, useless circle. Jonah tried to call out. Only a breath came. Then, from somewhere beyond the rim came the sound of a mule stopping hard in the dirt. A woman's voice followed. Not frightened, not loud, just close. Hold on. A rope dropped through the light, and a stranger began climbing down into the dark. Mercy Ridge was a small town built around three things: cattle, dust, and the kind of talk that never died once it found a mouth. In the summer of 1886, Jonah Vale knew all three too well. He owned a narrow spread east of the Sangre de Cristo foothills, a hard piece of land called Lantern Creek Ranch. The place had a stone spring house, 2 wind-bent cottonwoods, a horse barn with patched doors, and enough range to make richer men restless, especially Gideon Rusk. Rusk owned half the grazing leases between Mercy Ridge and the Salt Flats. He dressed like a banker, laughed like a judge, and rode through town as if every fence was only waiting to belong to him. Lantern Creek was the one piece he could never get. That morning, Jonah had ridden into town before the heat rose. He tied his gelding outside Dr. Amos Kincaid's office and stood on the porch longer than a man should stand before knocking. Inside, the room smelled of carbolic, tobacco, and old paper. Dr. Kincaid was thin, gray-bearded, and careful with silence. He had delivered half the children in Mercy Ridge and buried more than he cared to count. Jonah removed his hat. "I need to know something," he said. The doctor looked up from a ledger. Jonah's hand tightened around the brim. "My wife left 9 years ago saying I was the reason we never had a child." He forced the next words out. "I need to know if she was right." The doctor did not answer quickly. That was what broke Jonah. Not a denial, not a confirmation, the waiting. He turned before the examination could begin, before the old man could ask him to sit, before the truth had a chance to become real. Dr. Kincaid called after him, "Jonah," but Jonah was already through the door. Outside, a young mother on the boardwalk pulled her child closer without meaning to. 2 men near the feed sacks went quiet. A woman in a blue bonnet looked away too late. Mercy Ridge had heard enough of his shame to recognize its shape even when no one spoke. By afternoon, Jonah was back at Lantern Creek, working as if work could sand a question down until it stopped cutting. A gate hinge needed mending. A water trough had gone green. A calf had pushed through loose wire near the south pasture. He fixed all of it. He did not eat. He did not go inside. Near sunset, he walked to the old windmill cistern behind the dry wash. His father had dug it 30 years earlier, back when the spring ran stronger and the ranch still had enough water to waste. Now the windmill stood crooked above it, blades rusted and still, the platform bleached gray by sun. A frayed length of rope hung from the crossbeam. Jonah set one boot on the plank cover and leaned over the opening. He had meant only to check how far the water had fallen. He did not notice the crack running under his heel. The plank gave way. The rope burned across his palm and snapped. Then he was falling. When Clara Merritt heard the break, she was walking her mule along the south road with everything she owned tied behind the saddle. A tin medicine box, a bedroll, a cracked brown valise, a Bible with no cover, and a bundle of clean cloth she guarded more carefully than money. She had not planned to stop in Mercy Ridge. She had passed through too many towns that greeted a lone woman with questions, then chased her away with answers they made up themselves. She was 32, maybe 33. Sun had browned her face. Travel had worn the hem of her dark dress to threads. Her hands were steady in the way a person's hands become steady when panic has already disappointed them. She heard the crack again in memory. Not thunder, not a gunshot, wood. Then the faint sound of a man trying and failing to breathe. Clara left the road. Her mule balked at the fence. She tied it to a mesquite post and crossed the pasture on foot. At the cistern, dust still drifted from the opening. She looked down. A man lay among broken boards and stones, one arm twisted beneath him, blood darkening his sleeve. Clara did not waste breath calling for town. Town was too far. He was not. She tied her rope to the windmill tower, looped the other end around her waist, and tested the knot twice. Then she climbed down. Stone scraped her boots. Rust flakes cut her palms. Twice. The rope slipped and slammed her against the wall, but she kept descending. At the bottom, she knelt beside him. His pulse was uneven, but there. His skin was hot, too hot. She cut away his sleeve with a small knife. The gash on his upper arm was not only from the fall. The edge had been opened before, badly cleaned, worked over for days until infection had begun creeping in a red line toward his shoulder. "Stubborn fool," she whispered. Jonah did not hear her. Clara packed the wound, splinted the arm as best she could, and spent nearly an hour bringing him out of the cistern inch by inch. By the time she dragged him into the ranch house, the last sun had turned the windows copper. The house was spare, a table, 2 chairs, a stove, a shelf of chipped plates, a woman's blue ribbon tucked behind a clock that had stopped years ago. Clara noticed it. Then she noticed the dust around it. No one had touched that ribbon in a long time. She boiled water, cleaned the wound, found linen in a cupboard, and crushed willow bark into a cup. When fever took him near midnight, she sat beside the stove and changed the cloth on his forehead without complaint. Jonah woke sometime before dawn. The room was dark except for a low fire and a lantern burning on the table. The stranger sat with her back to the wall, mending a tear in her own glove. Her mule's bridle lay beside her boot. She looked ready to leave the moment the room no longer needed her. "You pulled me out," Jonah said. His voice sounded like gravel. She glanced up. "You fell in." "That was not what I asked. It is what happened." He tried to sit. Pain stopped him cold. Clara stood and crossed the room. "Lie still unless you want the fever to finish what the cistern started." Jonah stared at her hand as she checked the bandage. "You a nurse?" "No." "A doctor?" "No." "Then what are you?" Clara tightened the knot with the gentleness of someone used to causing necessary pain. "I have been useful in rooms where people were scared." It was the plainest answer he had ever heard, and for reasons he could not name, it made the house feel less empty than it had the night before. By morning, Clara had coffee on the stove and her mule saddled outside. Jonah found a folded note beside his cup. "Change the dressing after sunrise. Do not ride unless you are determined to die inconveniently. Eat something." There was no signature. He stepped onto the porch as she was tying down her valise. "You heading west?" he asked. That was the thought. Mercy Ridge is not much west of anything. I noticed. The quiet between them should have been awkward. It was not. It had the shape of 2 people who had both learned not to ask for more than they were offered. Before Clara could mount, a buckboard rattled into the yard. Mrs. Nell Ainsworth climbed down with a basket on one arm and righteous annoyance in her eyes. "Jonah Vale, you break your neck in a hole and expect the town to hear about it from a boy at the livery." Jonah leaned against the post. "Good morning, Nell. Do not good morning me." Then Nell saw Clara. Her face changed. Not suspicion first. Measurement. Within 10 minutes, Nell had learned that Clara had worked with a midwife near Fort Sumner, had treated miners' wives in Cirillos, and had once ridden 40 miles through sleet to help a girl deliver twins in a sheep camp. Nell put the basket on the table as if settling law. "We need you." Clara gave a tired smile. People always say that before they decide they do not. Nell's mouth softened. Then maybe stay until they prove otherwise. Jonah looked down at his coffee. Clara looked toward the road. The wind was already lifting dust off it, erasing the tracks she meant to follow. Jonah did not ask her to stay, not directly. He only said, "The back room has a bed, door sticks in wet weather, window faces east." Clara studied him. "When your fever breaks and your arm closes, I move on. That seems fair." It was not a promise, but it was something close enough to one. Mercy Ridge learned Clara's name the way towns learn everything, by pretending not to watch. She helped Dr. Kincaid set a broken wrist for the blacksmith's son. She sat through a long night with a fevered miner whose wife had no one else. She delivered a baby in the back room of the boarding house while rain hammered the roof, and the father prayed so loudly Nell threatened to put him outside. Clara never called herself anything grand. Not nurse, not healer, not miracle worker. She simply knew which herbs eased pain, which wounds needed boiling water, which fears should be answered, and which should be held quietly until dawn. At Lantern Creek, her presence gathered in small ways. A cup left near Jonah's chair before he knew he was thirsty. A torn shirt mended and folded. Fresh bread wrapped in a cloth beside the stove. In return, Jonah repaired the loose handle on her medicine box. He fixed the worn buckle on her mule's harness. One cold morning, Clara found her boots near the fire, dry and warm, though she had left them soaked on the porch. Neither of them mentioned these things. Mentioning them would have made them harder to keep. But Mercy Ridge noticed. And Mercy Ridge, when it noticed tenderness, often sharpened it into a weapon. By late September, Clara began hearing the name they used for her, the Bad Luck Woman. In one town, a mother had died after Clara helped with the birth. In another, a child had been stillborn before Clara arrived. Grief looks for a face when it cannot find a reason. Clara had become one. The name followed her from settlement to settlement, light enough to be denied, heavy enough to bend a life. Jonah heard his own name too, not Jonah. Not Vale, the empty man. The man no child would ever call father. The first time Clara heard it, they were outside Miller's store. Two ranch hands leaned against the rail, chewing tobacco and cruelty with the same lazy rhythm. "Rusk ought to buy Lantern Creek before it dies with him," one said. The other laughed. "A ranch needs sons." Vale's got silence. Clara's fingers tightened around the parcel in her arms. Jonah walked past as if he had heard nothing. That evening she found him in the barn repairing a saddle strap under lamplight. "You always let them talk that way." Jonah pulled the awl through leather. "Talking is cheaper than rope. Men use what they can afford." "That is not an answer. It is the only one I have left." Clara watched his hands. The left one was scarred from old rope burns. The right moved carefully because the wound still hurt. "Who told you it was true?" He stopped sewing. For a long moment the barn held only the horse's breathing and the faint slap of wind against loose boards. "My wife." Clara waited. Jonah set the strap down. "Eleanor." The name did not sound like a memory. It sounded like a door he had nailed shut and still heard knocking. "We were married 6 years," he said. "She wanted children. I did too. Every month ended the same. She went quiet first, then cold, then gone." "Did a doctor say you could not have children?" "No." "Did anyone examine you?" His jaw worked once. "I tried to ask today." "The day you fell," he nodded. "I left before Kincaid could answer." Clara did not soften the question. "Why?" Jonah looked toward the stall door and the dark line of the pasture beyond it. "Because if the town is right, I lose the last piece of myself I still argue for." Clara had no reply for that. A few days later, Gideon Rusk came to Lantern Creek. He arrived in a black coat, on a black horse, smiling like a man offering mercy. Jonah met him at the yard gate. Rusk did not dismount. "I heard you took another fall," he said. "Bad news travels with healthy legs." Rusk laughed. "I will make it the same offer, better than last time. Cash money. No shame in selling while the land still has value. No, You do not have anyone to leave it to. Jonah's eyes lifted. Rusk held the smile. That is not an insult, it is arithmetic. Clara was standing inside the doorway with a basin in her hands. Rusk looked past Jonah and tipped his hat at her. Careful, Mrs. Merritt. Mercy Ridge gets attached to strays until they become a burden. Jonah took one step forward. Clara saw the anger rise. Then she saw something worse. The anger stopped. Not because Jonah lacked courage, because the old shame had put a hand around his throat. Rusk rode away without raising his voice. He did not need to. That Sunday, the town gathered behind the church for a harvest supper. Long tables were set beneath the cottonwoods. Women carried pies and beans. Children chased each other through dust. Men talked cattle prices, rainfall, fence wire, winter feed. Clara came with Nell. Jonah stood near the wagon line, half in company and half out of it. Everything might have passed peacefully if Mercy Ridge had not been so sure peace was improved by punishment. Eleanor Vale arrived near noon. Clara recognized her before anyone spoke. Not from a portrait, from the way Jonah's body changed. Eleanor was finely dressed, pale gloves buttoned at the wrist, hat trimmed with black ribbon. Gideon Rusk walked a few paces behind her, as if he owned the air she moved through. The talking thinned. Eleanor did not approach Jonah. She did not have to. A woman near the punch bowl spoke loudly enough for half the yard to hear. Some houses go quiet because God knows not to send children there. There was laughter. Not much. Enough. Then another voice added, and now he keeps company with bad luck besides. Clara set down her cup. Jonah turned. For 1 second, Clara thought he would speak. She saw it in his face, in the hard line of his shoulders, in the way his hand closed at his side. But he did not. He looked toward Eleanor. Eleanor looked away. That was the moment Clara understood the wound was not only rumor. It was abandonment dressed as public fact. The ride back to Lantern Creek was silent. At the ranch, Jonah unhitched the team while Clara carried the dishes inside. The sun dropped behind the hills. The house cooled. A fly tapped at the window over and over. Finally, Clara said, "You do not have to defend every insult, but you have to defend the truth." Jonah stood near the stove. "I do not know the truth. Then go learn it." He laughed once, low and bitter. "You say that like a truth is waiting behind a counter, folded and labeled. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is not." Clara looked at him. "No. Sometimes you are just too tired to open the drawer." The words hit harder than she meant them to. Jonah did not answer. That night, Clara packed her valise. Before dawn, Jonah woke to a cold stove and a house too still to forgive him. Her room was empty. On the table lay a folded note. He opened it with the hand that still ached. A life built around other people's lies has no room for anything honest. I will not become another silence in this house. Clara. Jonah stood there until sunrise came through the window and made the note bright. After that, Lantern Creek became exactly what it had been before she arrived. That was the cruelest part. The fence still needed work. The cattle still had to be counted. The trough still froze along the edges before dawn. Coffee still boiled if he filled the pot. Nothing stopped. Everything hollowed. Some nights, Jonah found himself listening for the scrape of her chair. Some mornings he reached for a second cup before remembering there was no reason to pour it. 3 miles away, Clara took a room behind Dr. Kincaid's office. It was small, clean and cold. A bed, a washstand, one narrow shelf. She told herself it was enough. During the day, she worked until her thoughts had no room to stand. She cleaned instruments, rolled bandages, sat beside Mrs. Adler through a hard labor that ended in a living child and a mother too exhausted to cry, "Doctor." Kincaid watched Clara carefully. The old man knew what running looked like when it called itself usefulness. One afternoon, a storm tore part of the clinic roof loose. Rain leaked through the back room and soaked a stack of old boxes. Clara helped move them near the stove. Most held receipts, patient ledgers, church charity notes, and medical records written by Kincaid's predecessor, Dr. Lewin, who had died 5 winters earlier. "Burn what is ruined," Kincaid said. "Keep anything with signatures." Clara sorted for hours. Outside, rain rattled the window glass. Inside, the room smelled of wet paper and lamp oil. Then she saw the name, Jonah Vale. Clara's hands stilled. The first record was dated February 1877. The second, June 1878. The third, January 1879. All private visits. All before Eleanor left Lantern Creek. Clara read once, then again. The words were clinical, careful, and mercilessly plain. Eleanor had carried an injury from a fever years earlier, a complication no amount of wishing could change. Dr. Lewin had written that future childbearing was highly unlikely, and that the husband had not been examined because the medical cause was already known. Clara's breath caught. Beneath the records was a church charity ledger, a payment for stage passage west, signed by Gideon Rusk. A second paper followed, a notarized grazing option offered to Eleanor's brother 2 months before Jonah ever knew his wife was leaving. Then a loose letter, the ink faded but legible. "If Vale can be made to sell from shame rather than price, the creek line falls cleanly into Rusk range." There was no signature at the bottom. There did not need to be. Dr. Kincaid entered carrying a towel for the leak and stopped when he saw Clara's face. "What is it?" She turned the papers toward him. The doctor read in silence. His shoulders seemed to age as his eyes moved down the page. "I knew Lewin had seen Eleanor," he said. "I did not know about Rusk. Did Jonah ever see these?" "No." "Why not?" Kincaid removed his spectacles. "Lewin died. Eleanor left. Jonah never came back after asking. And maybe I was a coward for not dragging the truth to his door." Clara looked at the papers again. For 9 years, Jonah had carried a verdict no one had ever given him. Every joke, every offer, every glance at an empty chair. Not proof, a trap. By evening, the storm had passed. The street outside the clinic shone with mud and reflected lantern light. Men stepped carefully along the boardwalk. A child splashed near the pump until his mother scolded him. Across the street, Gideon Rusk came out of the hotel with Eleanor at his side. He was laughing. Clara watched from the clinic window. For the first time since leaving Lantern Creek, she did not feel torn between staying away and going back. She felt clear. Mercy Ridge held its town meeting 2 nights later in the schoolhouse, because the church was too small for the number of people pretending they had not come for scandal. The room smelled of chalk, damp wool, and stove smoke. Men filled the back wall. Women sat on benches with their hands folded tight. Children were sent outside, then crept under the windows anyway. Gideon Rusk arrived early. So did Eleanor. Jonah nearly did not come at all. Nell Ainsworth found him outside the livery, mounted and ready to turn toward home. "You have spent 9 years being polite to a lie," she said. "Be rude enough to hear the truth," so he came. He stood near the rear door, hat in hand, face unreadable. Clara entered with Dr. Kincaid and a leather folder pressed against her ribs. The room quieted as if a rope had been pulled through it. Kincaid spoke first. He did not perform. He did not accuse. He laid out dates, names, medical records, and the fact that Jonah Vale had never been examined because the records of Eleanor's condition had already explained what the marriage could not. A murmur moved across the benches. Then Clara read the letter. Not all of it. Enough if Vale can be made to sell from shame rather than price. The room changed, not loudly. The way a room changes when every person inside it understands they have been part of something ugly. Rusk stood. "That is private correspondence." Clara looked at him. So was his grief. No one laughed. Eleanor began crying before anyone asked her to speak. She admitted she had known. She admitted Gideon had arranged her passage and promised help for her family if Lantern Creek ever came to sale. She insisted she had not meant for the whole town to make Jonah a joke. Jonah listened from the back of the room. His face did not break. That made it worse. When the meeting ended, people stepped into the night without the usual noise. Apologies gathered near Jonah like frightened birds, landing and lifting before he could answer them. He did not want most of them. Outside, under a sky washed clean by rain, Clara stood near the schoolhouse steps. Jonah came down last. For a moment neither spoke. Then he said, "You found the drawer." A small sad smile crossed her face. "You were right. It was not folded and labeled. No. It was wet, half-ruined, and almost burned." Jonah looked past her toward the dark street, then back again. "I let you leave." "You did. I was ashamed. I know. I thought if I opened the truth and it was empty, I would have nothing left." Clara stepped closer. And now, Jonah took a breath that seemed to come from somewhere below old pain. "Now I think I was never empty, just lied to long enough to believe I was." Clara's eyes shone, but she did not reach for him. Not yet. Trust, once frightened, needs more than a revelation. It needs ordinary days to prove the revelation was not another storm. Jonah understood that, so he did not ask her to return that night. He only said, "The east window in the back room still sticks." Clara looked down, then up again. "Then fix it." For the first time in weeks, Jonah almost smiled. "I will." He fixed the window the next morning, then the porch step, then the hinge on her medicine box, though it no longer needed fixing. Clara did not move back to Lantern Creek at once. She kept the clinic room through winter, and Jonah rode into town twice a week with firewood, clean water, or supplies she never asked for but never refused. Mercy Ridge changed slowly. Some people apologized with words, some with pies, some with the simpler kindness of never repeating the old names again. Gideon Rusk's offers stopped, not because greed had left him, but because shame, once exposed, loses much of its market value. Men who had nodded along with him now remembered urgent business whenever he entered a room. Eleanor left before Christmas. Jonah watched her stage pull away without hatred. That surprised him. For years, he had thought the truth would bring rage. Instead, it brought space. The first real snow fell in January. It powdered the cottonwoods and turned the red road white by morning. A boy named Tommy Bell, whose mother had died of fever 2 years earlier, began spending afternoons at the clinic, carrying water for Clara and reading dime novels in the corner. He was not Clara's child. He was not Jonah's. But by February, Jonah had built him a small wooden sled. By March, Clara had sewn him a coat from an old army blanket. By April, Tommy was sleeping more often in the back room at Lantern Creek than in the loft over his uncle's stable. Nobody announced a family. It formed the way springs return, quietly, under the ground first, then everywhere at once. When Clara and Jonah married in late May, they did it beneath the 2 cottonwoods by the spring house. Nell cried into a handkerchief and denied it. Dr. Kincaid stood straight as a fence post and gave Clara away because she had asked him, not because she needed giving. Tommy held the rings in a little tin box and nearly dropped them twice. There was no grand speech, only vows spoken clearly, with the creek running behind them and the wind moving through new leaves. Years later, travelers knew Lantern Creek as the place where a lantern burned in the window for anyone arriving after dark. Clara opened a small birthing room beside the spring house. Women came from sheep camps, mining cabins, ranches, and towns that had once turned her away. Jonah expanded the water line and built a porch wide enough for waiting husbands, tired children, and any stray soul who needed to sit without being questioned. Tommy grew tall there. So did the cattle. So did the trees. And every summer, when the old windmill creaked above the sealed cistern, Jonah remembered the day he thought he had fallen into the end of his life. He had not. He had fallen into the truth. One evening, long after Mercy Ridge had found newer stories to tell, Jonah stood near the fence watching sunset spill across Lantern Creek. Clara stepped out of the house carrying a lamp. Tommy, nearly grown now, crossed the yard with 2 buckets, and complained loudly enough for both of them to hear. Jonah smiled. The springhouse door stood open. Warm light touched the stone. From inside came the sound of a newborn crying while its mother laughed in relief. Clara set the lamp on the porch rail. Jonah looked at the house, the boy, the woman who had climbed down into darkness without knowing his name. For 9 years, Mercy Ridge had called him empty, but emptiness had never been the truth. It had only been a darkness no one had been brave enough to enter. Clara had entered, and when she came back up, she brought the light with her.